What's up, everyone? It's Goose, and today I am craving a soup. It's getting really cold. Today was originally going to be comparing the 5150 model in the Quad Cortex to the one in the FM9. And by 5150, I'm actually talking about the EVH 5150s. I was excited to do this comparison because the 5150 is just kind of a staple amp. It's probably one of the most commonly used amps, and the EVH versions are just the modern kind of version of the original PV versions. When doing these amp comparisons, I was like, yeah, let's do that. So I did some research at first on Fractal's website when they talked about the 5150 model that they modeled. It was a 6L6 100 watt. They also have a version of just the blue channel of the 50 watt, but I was like, okay, they have the blue and red channels of the 100 watt 5150. Let's go with that one. And then I went on to Neural's site, which also said they had a 5150 6L6 100 watt modeled, in addition to the EL34, which we're not going to get into today. But the important part was that it seemed like there were matching models. And then I turned on my Quad Cortex to see the letter S in the models on the Quad Cortex. So it seems like despite Neural having the regular 5150 6L6 100 watt listed on their website, the Quad Cortex actually models a stealth. And when I initially compared the two, yeah, they were kind of different. So I actually ended up contemplating just not doing this video at all. But here's the thing about Fractal amps that's amazing. You can basically mod an amp within the Fractal. So in addition to having just the regular controls that you would expect from the amplifier, you could literally just stay on that tab and never go to the other more detailed tabs. But they also have settings for the preamp, the power amp, even the speaker impedance. And so you can adjust all these things. You're basically modding an amp using the other settings. And so easily one amp block in a Fractal unit has like 5 times the settings of something like a Quad Cortex. So I decided I have both of these units. Let's make a stealth model in the Fractal, because the stealth is essentially a mod of the 6L6 100 watt. And so that's what today's video is going to be about. We're going to make a stealth model within the FM9. Real quick before we continue, if you like the content you're seeing here, consider hitting like and subscribe. It greatly helps out my channel. All right, so I had to do some digging as to kind of the actual changes between the stealth version and the regular 6L6 at 100 watt. And so here are a few things I gathered. The 50 watt 6L6 actually has more gain than the 100 watt, not only because of just the wattage being lower and less headroom, but also because there were preamp changes made. And these are preamp changes that made it into the stealth version. So on the actual gain dial, which affects the preamp gain, there's basically double the gain. Both EVH's site as well as various forum posts mention that there's just more low-end response with both the blue and red channels, as well as the new resonance knob, which is basically a depth knob. There are also voicing changes to those two in order to make them more modern. And the way I hear it is just that there's more snarl to the tone. So when I'm playing on the lower strings, the definition of the note just tends to become more clear, which benefits extended range guitars a lot. Lastly, there's more body to the tone. So when I'm playing, I feel like there's just a little bit more like maybe low mid grunt to the tone, but not necessarily feeling like it's bassier either. So I made a few changes. So in the main tab, there's an input trim, and I basically just set this to 1.5. You would think that this kind of acts like a boost going into the amp. So really what the input trim is doing is adjusting the amount of gain within the dial of the amp. And there's no frequency response changes. So this was a great way to just match the gain levels of the Quad Cortex version of the 5150 Stealth. And since there's more low end and resonance, I looked to the 50 watt blue channel version. And on that version, the low pass filter in the preamp section is actually just set to minimum. So I did the same thing to the 6L6 100 watt, and copying most of the settings from the 50 watt blue channel over to the 100 watt red channel. Actually, were the same settings as the 100 watt blue channel. So, but the biggest thing about the voicing that I heard is that snarl that I mentioned earlier. So what I did was I went to the EQ tab and I actually changed the definition. The definition dial actually adjusts the entire frequency range going into the amp. And so after playing around with it, for the red channel specifically, I set it to about 6, which feels very extreme, but it actually ends up sounding pretty close. And lastly, there's a little bit more body to the tone when you're like picking. So under the dynamics tab, I just ended up putting the input dynamics to about 6, and that gave it a bit more of that response, that body in the response that I was getting from the quad Cortex unit, but not the Fractal. And so those are the modifications made. Here's the list of them again, just so that you have them handy. And I am shocked as to how close this got. All right, as you heard from those two clips, it feels really similar now. The snarl is there, the low end response is there, and that impresses me so much because the settings are exactly the same between the quad Cortex model and the Fractal models on the dials. And since we're making back-end changes to the actual amp models in the Fractal, all the dials correspond the same way that they would on the quad Cortex. Here's some more riffs comparing the new version, the quad Cortex, as well as the old version of the 6L6, so you can judge for yourself. They're running the same settings. The only difference is the non-stealth actually needs to be at about 4 on the gain dial in order to match the other two. And the IR is the one I loved using. It's the In Your Face and Further by Christian Cole. So I think these two sound so close now. And going through forums, I know a lot of people were asking for the stealth model in the Fractal. And so I hope that this kind of helps everyone get that sound. Maybe until Fractal actually releases a stealth model. But they've made it clear in the forum post as well that you can basically achieve that with the settings provided. So this is the closest I've gotten, and I'm actually really impressed at the model to be able to do that. And so also, in addition to the red channel, the blue channel is also modeled for both the stealth on the quad Cortex as well as the non-stealth on the FM9. So putting the same modded settings into the FM9 version, I wanted to compare the blue channels as well. The only difference I had between the red channel and the blue channel is I actually reduced the definition down to about 2. I actually think you could get away without the definition at all with the blue channel. But yeah, let's compare those two channels and let me know what you think. So once again, I did set the definition at 2. I think you could get away with not using the definition knob at all, and these two would be even closer. One last comparison I wanted to do. We're going to do the volume knob test where I basically compare at max volume on the guitar knob versus minimum versus midway. So you can see how well both of these units clean up when you roll down the volume. And again, this will be on the blue channel. So in my opinion, I think the Fractal just cleans up slightly more. I find that the saturation of the Quad Cortex doesn't really go away at the midway point. You just get a cleaner sound out of the FM9 when you roll your volume knob all the way down. Of course, users of a 5150 Stealth, I don't know how often you're going to be doing that, but this is just a general trend I'm noticing with the Quad Cortex. However, it still cleans up, I think, enough to where it's usable. And I think this is, at this point, kind of a nitpick. Generally, digital amps don't do as well with that kind of cleanup versus like a tube amp. My final thoughts actually are that I think this is one of the amps to use within these two units. Basically, in the Quad Cortex, I think this is the tightest amp, for high gain at least. For that extended range sort of genty style of playing, the snarl of the 5150 is really unmatched in my opinion. That's why you see it in studios all over. And the only really other amp I think might have that I haven't gone over in the Quad Cortex is the Uberschall. But the Uberschall is actually a warmer amp. So if you're looking for absolute tight and like snarly guitar tones, the 5150 Stealth in the Quad Cortex is the way to go, in my opinion. But now with the settings I have, I also have that in my FM9. And maybe there are more adjustments I could make to make them even closer. So if you have any thoughts about that, leave it down in the comments below. Did I get close enough to the tone in the Quad Cortex with the FM9? Or even if you like the regular 5150 6L6 100 watt non-stealth version over the stealth. In some instances, I do like the non-stealth version too, and I'm glad I have both options in the FM9. If there are any other amps you want me to compare between the Quad Cortex and the FM9, or even the HX Stomp, make sure to let me know, and I will catch y'all in the next one. Later!